The biting Boston wind meant nothing. His left foot, surprisingly nimble, gripped the paintbrush, dipping it into ochre. Every deliberate stroke on the canvas was a defiant roar against the screech of tires and shattered glass that had stolen his hands 3 years ago. On this cold pavement, Samuel Blackwood painted, not for pity, but for the fierce, desperate need to simply exist. The November air over Boston had a bite to it, a damp chill that promised a harsh winter and clung to the gray stone of the old buildings. On a forgotten corner, where the city's commercial bustle began to fray into quieter residential streets, Samuel Blackwood didn't feel the cold. Or rather, he chose to ignore it, channeling every ounce of his concentration downward to his feet. He was 47, but his face, etched with lines of frustration and a stubborn, defiant pride, looked older. Propped against the leg of a worn wooden easel was a small canvas. Beside it, an array of paint tubes lay in a meticulously organized row on a dirty drop cloth. His right foot, surprisingly nimble, anchored his makeshift palette, a scarred piece of plywood. His left, the artist, was his instrument. With a practiced curl of his toes, he gripped a brush, dipped it into a smear of ochre, and applied it to the canvas with a steady, deliberate stroke. He was painting a sliver of the city most people ignored. The way the late morning sun caught the rust on a fire escape across the street, turning decay into a momentary blaze of gold. His strokes weren't delicate, they were raw, imbued with a fierce, almost desperate energy. It was the only way he knew how to speak anymore. 3 years since the screech of tires and the shatter of glass had cleaved his life in two. Before, his hands had been his voice, translating the world into color and form, with an eloquence that had once earned him gallery representation. Now they were gone, replaced by scarred stumps at the end of his forearms, a constant, phantom ache. The city flowed past him, a river of preoccupied faces. A few people would slow, their curiosity piqued by the bizarre sight. Some would drop $1 or a handful of coins into the open guitar case at his side, their eyes filled with a pity he despised more than their indifference. They saw a tragedy, a spectacle. They didn't see the art. They didn't see the careful composition, the bold use of color, the soul-deep need to create that drove him to this cold pavement day after day. He wasn't a beggar. He was Samuel Blackwood, a painter. And in this cold, indifferent corner of the world, that was the only truth he had left. Across the street, inside the warm, fragrant haven of cobblestone brews, Alicia Vargas had been watching Samuel for 3 weeks. She was 28, with observant dark eyes that often seemed to be looking past the surface of things. She wiped down the gleaming espresso machine, the rhythmic motion of familiar comfort, but her attention was fixed on the man hunched over his easel. Alicia wasn't just a barista. She had been an art history major, 2 semesters shy of her degree when her mother's illness forced her to drop out and take the first job she could find. The debt had piled up, the dream had receded, but the eye remained. She saw things in Samuel's work that the fleeting glances of passers-by could never capture. She saw the influence of the German expressionists, the raw, emotional power of Kirchner, the unapologetic use of color that spoke of a spirit refusing to be muted. His technique was unconventional, born of necessity, but the vision behind it was pure, untaught, and profoundly moving. He wasn't just copying a scene, he was dissecting its soul. She saw the passers-by drop their petty coins into his case. She saw the flicker of humiliation that crossed his face, a shadow he quickly masked with a stoic glare at his canvas. And she understood. To offer him money like that would be an insult. It would group her with the others who saw only his loss, not his gift. So she devised a different approach, a ritual. That first day, she'd waited for a lull in the morning rush, poured a simple black coffee into a paper cup, and walked across the street. She placed it on the edge of his drop cloth, a safe distance from his work. He'd tensed, his entire body going rigid, expecting another act of charity. "I like your painting," she said, her voice soft but clear, gesturing with her chin toward his canvas. "The way you captured the light on the brick." Then she turned and walked away without waiting for a response. She did it again the next day, and the day after that. A hot black coffee, no sugar, no cream. A simple declarative statement of appreciation. I love the blue in that one. The perspective is amazing. He never replied. He would just stare at her with a guarded, almost suspicious intensity. But each day, after she was safely back behind the counter of the cafe, she would watch as his left foot would carefully nudge the cup closer, and he would eventually bend down to drink, the steam warming a face that was otherwise a mask of stone. It was a small thing, a single cup of coffee, but it was an offering not to a disabled man but to a fellow artist. It was a flicker of light in his cold, gray world. The sky, which had been a sullen gray all day, finally broke. It wasn't a gentle drizzle but a sudden, violent deluge, as if a celestial bucket had been upended. The wind whipped the rain sideways, turning Alicia's coffee run umbrella inside out. For Samuel, it was a catastrophe. The heavy drops hammered his canvases, and he watched in horror as a vibrant sunset scene began to bleed, the reds and oranges running like tears down the primed surface. His paints, his brushes, his entire world on a 3 by 5 foot patch of sidewalk were being assaulted. He scrambled, using his body to shield his most recent work, but it was a futile effort. The water pooled on his drop cloth, creating a muddy swirl of colors. The few dollars in his case were soaked. A wave of cold, bitter despair washed over him, more chilling than the rain itself. It was over. The day was a ruin, a perfect metaphor for his life. As he began the clumsy, humiliating process of packing up his sodden mess, a shadow fell over him. He looked up to see a large, steady black umbrella creating a small circle of shelter around him. It was Alicia. This time, she wasn't just holding a cup of coffee. Tucked under her other arm was a flat, rectangular object. The rain came out of nowhere, she said, her voice calm amidst the drumming of the downpour. He just grunted, his frustration a tight knot in his chest. But then she knelt, her jeans instantly darkening from the wet ground, and placed the object next to him. It was a picture frame. Simple, made of dark wood, but clean and well-made, with a crisp white matting inside. She pointed with a slim finger at a small canvas he had managed to keep mostly dry, a moody, evocative piece depicting a lone street lamp, its light fracturing in the wet asphalt of a rainy night. I'd like to buy this one, she said, as if they were in a hushed gallery and not a storm-battered street corner. Samuel stared at her, then at the painting. He was about to shake his head to wave her away, when she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small wad of cash. She counted out 4 crisp $20 bills and held them out. $80. The amount was so stunning, so absurdly respectful that it short-circuited his brain. It was more than he sometimes made in a week. It wasn't charity, it was a price. A real price. He still hesitated, a lifetime of pride warring with the stark reality of his situation. Seeing his conflict, Alicia picked up the wooden frame. She carefully held it up, positioning it around the small painting of the street lamp. And in that moment everything changed. Framed, even in the gray, rainy light, the painting was transformed. It was no longer a piece of street art on a dirty sidewalk. It was a work, complete, valued. In that simple, profound gesture, Alicia had done more than offer to buy his art. She had affirmed his identity. She saw him, not the cripple on the corner, but Samuel Blackwood, the painter. A tremor started in his shoulders. He reached out with a trembling foot, nudging the painting toward her. He couldn't speak. He watched as she carefully slid the bills under a dry corner of his paint box. When he finally looked up at her, his vision was blurry. It took him a moment to realize it wasn't just the rain. For the first time in 3 years, he was crying. Alicia carried the small canvas back to her apartment as if it were a sacred artifact. The rain had plastered her hair to her forehead and her shoes squelched with every step, but she barely noticed. Inside her tiny, book-filled studio, she carefully dried the painting's edges with a soft cloth. When she finally slid it into the dark wood frame and secured the back, she propped it on her mantelpiece and stepped back. Under the warm, focused light of her reading lamp, the painting came alive. The single street lamp wasn't just a source of light, it was a beacon of defiant solitude. The fractured reflections on the wet pavement weren't just an observation. They were a complex tapestry of loneliness and hope. It was magnificent, and a profound, gut-wrenching sadness washed over her. A talent like this, a voice so powerful, shouldn't be at the mercy of the weather and the fleeting pity of strangers. It deserved to be seen, properly. An idea, audacious and terrifying, began to take root in her mind. It was more than a whim, it felt like a responsibility. She was the one who could see. Therefore, she was the one who had to act. The next day, Alicia opened a separate savings account. Into it, she transferred $2,000, the money she had been painstakingly setting aside for the last year, a fragile hope of one day returning to her art history studies. The dream of the classroom felt distant now, replaced by a mission that was immediate and visceral. Her life took on a dual rhythm. By day, she was Alicia the barista, serving lattes and cappuccinos with a friendly smile. By night and on her days off, she became a determined amateur art curator. She scoured the internet, making lists of community centers, pop-up venues, and small, independent galleries in Boston's South End, an area known for its vibrant art scene, but also for its more accessible, less pretentious spaces. She sent dozens of emails, her inquiries polite but persistent. Meanwhile, her ritual with Samuel evolved. She still brought him his daily coffee, but now, every few days, she would buy a painting. She'd study his collection, ask him about a specific piece, and pay him the same respectful price. $80, $100, sometimes more for a larger canvas. He grew accustomed to her visits, the suspicion in his eyes slowly replaced by a quiet, questioning trust. "What are you doing with all of them?" he finally asked one afternoon, his voice raspy from disuse. It was the first full sentence he had ever spoken to her. Alicia paused, her heart thumping. "I believe in them," she said simply, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I believe people need to see them." He didn't understand, not yet. He saw only a kind, enigmatic girl who was single-handedly keeping him afloat. He had no idea that in a small, rented-out space on Harrison Avenue, a stack of dark wood frames was growing, and a quiet, determined plan was coming together, piece by precious piece. The invitation was a simple, elegant postcard Alicia had designed herself. It read, "Urban Echoes, the Art of Samuel Blackwood." Below the title was a high-quality photograph of the street lamp painting. It took her a week of gentle but firm persuasion to get Samuel to agree to come. The idea of being the center of attention, of being looked at, filled him with a familiar dread. "They'll just be staring at me," he'd rasped, the old bitterness creeping back. "No," Alicia had insisted, her conviction unwavering. "They'll be looking at your work." The gallery was a small, intimate space with warm brick walls and polished hardwood floors. Alicia had spent every spare cent and called in every favor she could. The owner, a kind older woman who'd been moved by Alicia's story, had given her a significant discount. Her coworkers from the cafe had helped her paint and hang the lights. Now, on the opening night, the space was transformed. When Samuel entered, leaning on a simple cane Alicia had bought for him, he stopped dead just inside the doorway. His breath hitched. He saw his own soul reflected back at him, but not as the fractured, messy thing he felt it to be. Here it was curated, honored. The raw, desperate energy he poured onto his canvases on that cold sidewalk had been transmuted into something powerful and beautiful. He saw the rust on the fire escape, the melancholy of a deserted alleyway, the defiant bloom of a weed in a sidewalk crack. All the forgotten moments he had tried to save, now saved themselves, elevated and enshrined. The crowd was small but sincere. Alicia had personally invited them, regulars from the cafe, residents from her apartment building, members of a local art appreciation forum she'd joined. They moved through the space with a quiet reverence, their voices a low, respectful murmur. Samuel took a hesitant step forward, then another, drawn into the orbit of his own creations. He walked towards the first painting, the one of the fire escape. He remembered the biting wind that day, the way his toes had cramped around the brush. But here, under the soft glow of the gallery light, the rust wasn't just decay. It was a fiery testament to endurance. He saw a man in a worn coat, his face a mask of concentration, leaning in close to examine the thick impasto of a piece depicting a rain-slicked alley. "The texture is incredible," the man whispered to his companion. "You can feel the grit." They didn't even glance in Samuel's direction. His deepest fear of being a spectacle was unfounded. He was invisible, and for the first time in 3 years it felt like a blessing. Only his work was visible, and it was being truly seen. Near the back wall, a man with a thoughtful expression and a silver-streaked beard stood motionless before the street lamp painting, the very first one Alicia had bought. He held a small notebook, but he wasn't writing. He was just looking, his head tilted, his gaze intense. Alicia recognized him from his blog's profile picture. Arthur Vance, a local critic whose opinion carried surprising weight in the city's art circles. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The cumulative effect was too much. The validation, the respect, the sheer, overwhelming kindness of it all. A dam inside him that had held back 3 years of grief and humiliation finally broke. He found an alcove near a window, turning his back to the room. The strength went out of his legs, and he braced himself against the wall. He covered his face with his hand, but he couldn't stop the silent, racking sobs that shook his entire frame. It was a storm of gratitude, of loss, of a hope so painful he'd thought he'd never feel it again. Alicia saw it happen. She had been watching him, her own emotions a fragile mix of terror and elation. She let him have his moment, then she moved towards him, navigating through her guests. She didn't carry a glass of wine. Instead, she held a familiar paper cup, filled with the warm, spiced apple cider she'd been serving. She didn't say a word. She just stood beside him and gently placed the cup on the windowsill within his reach. He lowered his hand, his face wet, and looked at her. In her eyes he saw no pity, only a shared, triumphant warmth. The gesture was everything. It was the coffee on the cold sidewalk. It was the frame in the pouring rain. It was the anchor in the storm of this unbelievable night. The impact of that night rippled outward in ways neither Samuel nor Alicia could have predicted. 2 days after the opening, Arthur Vance's blog post went live. It was titled, "The Man Who Paints with His Soul," and it was a masterpiece of critical appreciation. Vance wrote not of Samuel's disability. He only alluded to an artist who had overcome profound physical adversity, but of the raw, undeniable power of the work itself. He praised the guttural honesty of the brushwork and the deeply empathetic eye that found beauty in the city's forgotten corners. The post was shared on social media, then picked up by a larger city arts publication. By the second and final day of the exhibition, the small gallery was packed. People came not out of morbid curiosity, but out of genuine artistic interest. Red dots began to appear on the title cards next to the paintings. A young couple bought the one of the weed blooming in the sidewalk crack. An elderly woman, her eyes misty, purchased the view of the rusted fire escape. The most significant visitor arrived late that afternoon. He was a quiet, well-dressed man named Mr. Chen, who owned a small but respected gallery in the Back Bay neighborhood. He spent nearly an hour in the space, studying each painting with a practiced, discerning eye. Finally, he approached Alicia, who was manning a small table by the door. He didn't buy just one painting. He bought 3 of the largest canvases and left his card. "I'd like to speak with the artist," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I want to discuss representation." When the weekend was over, Alicia sat with Samuel at a small table in the now empty gallery, a simple calculator and a shoebox full of receipts between them. After paying the gallery rental fee and reimbursing herself for the frames, they had sold 14 paintings. The total came to just over $9,000. Samuel stared at the number on the calculator's screen. It was an impossible figure, a sum of money he hadn't seen in one place in nearly a decade. It was enough to rent a small apartment with a spare room for a studio. It was enough to buy proper art supplies, to eat without worry, to finally leave the cold sidewalk behind. It was a lifeline. But more than the money, it was the slip of paper lying next to the calculator that held the real treasure. Mr. Chen's business card, with the words Chen Gallery embossed in elegant gold font. It wasn't just a reprieve, it was a future. The door hadn't just been unlocked, it had been thrown wide open. 3 months later, Alicia pushed open the door to a bright, airy studio in the South End. The scent of turpentine and fresh coffee hung in the air, a fragrance of creation. Sunlight streamed through a large warehouse window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. At the center of the room, Samuel sat on a low stool before a large easel, a custom-built stand holding his palette at foot level. The bitter tension in his face was gone, replaced by a quiet, focused calm. He greeted her with a warm nod, gesturing with his head toward a finished canvas leaning against the far wall. Alicia walked over to it and her breath caught. It was a painting of her, or rather a portrait of a memory. A young woman, silhouetted against a rising sun, stood on a city sidewalk. In her hand she held a single paper cup, not as a simple beverage but like a lantern, casting a warm, golden light. Her shadow stretched long and steady behind her. "I've been saving it for you." Samuel's voice was soft, imbued with a new, easy confidence. Alicia could only stare, deeply moved. "Samuel, it's beautiful." "You know," she said, finally turning back to him, a bright, hopeful smile on her face. "I re-enrolled, art history. Night classes start next month." She looked from his face to the vibrant, living art that filled the room. "Watching you, it reminded me that it's never too late to fight for what you love." Their lives, once stalled by circumstance, were now moving forward, illuminated by a shared light that had all begun with the simple, profound warmth of a single cup of coffee.